So welcome everyone. My name is Rupal Mehta and I'm the Chair of Research and the Postdoctoral Fellows Program and a Senior Fellow here at CGSR, and I'll be moderating the lecture today. It is my great pleasure to welcome our speaker, Matthew Costlow. Matt Costlow is a Senior Analyst at the National Institute for Public Policy. He was previously a staff member of the 2023 Strategic Posture Commission and the 2018 National Defense Strategy Commission. He previously served as a special assistant in the Office of Nuclear and Missile Defense Policy, Office of the Secretary of Defense. Matt's talk will introduce some new research that he's been working on the axis of cooperation between China, Russia, North Korea, and Iran. Adversary cooperation and opportunism is growing to such an extent between China, Russia, North Korea, and Iran that it is no longer sufficient to label China the pacing threat. Instead, the United States should adopt a strategy of pacing the threats of opportunistic and coordinated aggression. So this talk will follow the format of other CGSR seminars. Matt will speak for about 30 to 45 minutes, and then we will start the Q&A. During his talk, please feel free to get your questions ready, and you can start raising your hands electronically, which is our preferred method of engagement with the speaker, or typing questions into the chat while he is speaking. So thank you so much, Matt, for joining us today, and over to you.
Well, thank you, Rupal, and thank you to CGSR for having me. It's always an honor to be here, at least virtually, and be talking with so many just incredibly smart people. I've always been impressed with the membership of CGSR and their webinars, and thank you to Brad and Mike for extending this invitation. So my talk will go off of a report that I just wrote, and let's see, I will put a link to the report in the chat. And what spurred this was a line in the 2022 Nuclear Posture Review, which talks about extreme circumstances in which the United States may have to rely more heavily on nuclear weapons to deter opportunistic aggression. And it's just kind of one line in the broader document, but it struck me that very little research has been done into what does relying more on nuclear weapons mean for a second theater? And wouldn't things in the first theater, you know, assuming the US is in a conflict, say in Europe or in Asia, in the second theater, presumably things would be affected by what happens in the first theater. And so all these questions sort of led me to want to write on what is opportunistic aggression, what is coordinated aggression, is it just the amalgamation of all these threats, or is there something kind of new, unique about opportunistic aggression that we should probably anticipate and at least prepare for as U.S. nuclear strategy and broader defense strategy is sort of in this transition period of you know, what systems do we buy, how many do we buy, on what timeline. The more we can anticipate what these future threats are, the better we can mold the ongoing modernization program to fit what our deterrence requirements are anticipated to be. So with that introduction, I am just going to start going through part of the report. Essentially, I asked quite a few senior reviewers, including Brad Roberts, to kind of check my work on this and make sure I'm not repeating something else that someone else has written or done something that has already been done. And they all agreed a lot was needed in this area. And I appreciated Admiral Charles Richard, who until recently was the head of Strategic Command. He put a offered to put a forward to my paper in which he called the emerging threat environment a crisis of deterrence. And I thought that was an apt description because it gives the urgency that I think is needed, that something like the Strategic Posture Commission has called for. But it also points us towards the potential solution, right? It's better understanding the threat so we can better tailor the deterrence. So let me describe a little bit um, what I think the bottom line up front takeaway should be. When you think of opportunistic aggression, I think the best way to think about it is that it both creates dilemmas for the United States and it creates advantages for adversaries. So, what do I mean by that? Posing multiple threats to the United States over its huge geographic network of alliances. Uh, Opportunistic aggression basically forces the US to either prioritize some allies over others, come to the defense of one set of allies in Europe or Indo-Pacific to the detriment of others, or it forces us to spread our forces as equally as possible and risk failure in both theaters. And so it forces these really difficult decisions on US leaders about what to prioritize, how to prioritize things, and who to prioritize with. But it also creates these advantages for adversaries that I think you can fairly say, with the kind of opportunistic nature of Russia, China, North Korea, and Iran, they're going to recognize these advantages. There's political advantages, there's military advantages, diplomatic advantages. Uh, the only major kind of disadvantage is, well, who goes first, right? Who begins the conflict? Uh, but from there, things get much more difficult for the United States. It has to choose what type of strategy it does, whether it tries to escalate quickly in the first theater in the hopes of reinforcing the second theater more quickly. It has to decide whether it can slog through in one theater because we actually value our alliances in a second theater and think of them as a greater under a greater threat. And so maybe we don't pool as many resources into an ongoing conflict. So there's just think of opportunistic aggression as um, threats multiplied and challenges multiplied. They're not simply additional kind of summary or summation challenges. They're actually kind of multiplied because failure in one theater can lead to failure in other theaters. So failing in a current conflict can lead to deterrence failure elsewhere, or it can lead to an intensification of conflict elsewhere. So there's not just one um, there's not just one audience is probably the best way to think about it. When it's just a bilateral conflict, the US only has to worry about the one actor. Uh, but when it's multiple, when it's fighting in one theater and then deterring another actor in a wholly separate geographic theater that's probably quite some distance away in quite different domains, that leads to a whole new way of approaching conflict, a whole new way of messaging, of signaling. And so that's really what I wanted to bring to this study. And hopefully if you kind of read it, that'll come through that uh, things are just much more difficult when you're approaching an opportunistic or coordinated aggression problem than it would be if it's simply Russia plus North Korea or China plus Iran. It could very well be uh, a fight with Russia while deterring multiple adversaries in multiple other theaters. Uh, So perhaps the long and short of it is uh, we are moving away from this focus on individual actors and moving towards a world where we actually have to take into account a lot more actors, mostly because of their nuclear arsenal increases, but also just the nature of their regimes. They are already opportunistic. They're already looking for opportunities to advance their kind of revisionist agenda. And the US, since it's essentially decided not to build a two-war strategy or a two-war force with its conventional forces, it's unintentionally leading to this increased risk of aggression everywhere. So let me just quickly go through what I think are some of the unique aspects of opportunistic and coordinated aggression. Um, I don't think I need to explain to this audience all the uh, individual states like China, Russia, North Korea, Iran. Uh, I think you all are well aware of what each state individually is doing. You know, China with its breakout in nuclear weapons, both the size and the speed. I think the speed doesn't get enough attention. We're kind of awed by the numbers, but I think the speed is really uh, going to be one of the determining factors about just how uh, difficult this challenge is going to be in the long term. It's an area where we are not well suited, although we seem to be getting better. Um, Let me instead focus instead of on the individual states, just focus on the unique aspects of opportunistic aggression. And some of this was brought out in the 2023 Strategic Posture Commission report that I mentioned earlier. Uh, One of the main takeaways of that report was if the United States does not prepare now, it won't have the forces it needs later, and it may unintentionally create the conditions for deterrence failure. And that is kind of across the board. That's with conventional forces, it's with nuclear forces, it's with missile defense. There's just a host of areas that adversaries are building their arsenals to exploit, and the US is ill prepared to counter those exploitations. Um, so one area I think that deserves to be highlighted is what I call this kind of growing political and military entente between China, Russia, North Korea, and Iran. And rightfully so, I think China and Russia receive the most analysis. You know, they're the largest powers. China's on its way to becoming a nuclear peer with the United States. Russia's already there. Uh, all of these, all of their interaction and cooperation deserves a lot of analysis uh, and study. But I don't think we should sleep on uh, Russia and say North Korea. We've seen their cooperation. In fact, we've seen a formal treaty signed between the two, a security guarantee. And so, at least according to open sources, in return for North Korea supplying short range missiles and troops and other material to support the Russian war effort in Ukraine, Russia seems to be uh, giving North Korea access to very sensitive technology, potentially nuclear, potentially uh, rocket related, um, potentially satellite related. So there's a host of kind of what I call a division of labor that Russia and China and their junior partners, but still very dangerous partners, North Korea and Iran, they're finding kind of economies of force that they can um, better utilize each other. They may not always have the most common ends, but they do have a common enemy, which is the United States, and common adversaries from their perspective, with U.S. allies. And so there's a lot of opportunism just in their alliance with each other. And some of it is a less formal alliance, like Russia and Iran. They haven't signed a security treaty like they have with North Korea, but they have increased their cooperation. And we may see over the next few years what Russian cooperation has actually led to with advances either in air defense or space with Iran or oil. There's just a host of reasons why um, Russia, China, North Korea, and Iran would find it useful to work with each other and and gain efficiencies that they might not otherwise have. Uh, and since it's going to hurt the United States, then all the better. And so something that Commander of Northcom, General Guillot, has said repeatedly at this point, the U.S. shouldn't uh, enter a conflict with one of these states, believing that that conflict will stay limited to just that state. Since this network of cooperation is growing between China, Russia, North Korea, and Iran, we should actually expect other states to enter the conflict in kind of more or less open terms. It could be uh, material support. It could rise all the way to troops. We just don't know. It's so fluid, and even if the security pact doesn't necessarily guarantee entering one theater per se, um, they might find it very useful to take advantage of the U.S.'s shortage of resources to fight multiple peer adversaries in multiple theaters. So there's just a huge opportunity um, that regimes that are already bent on revisionist terms, they might see the odds of never getting better in terms of uh, there's never going to be a better chance for them to achieve their objectives at less cost than when the U.S. is already depleted in its munitions. Its defense industrial base is very low, uh, not going very quickly in a number of areas. And so to them, the incentive structure is there to strike while the iron is hot, essentially. That's just one of the major aspects of opportunistic aggression that I think gets overlooked. So let me spout a few uh, conclusions that I kind of come to in terms of why opportunistic aggression is unique. It's not just Russia plus China plus North Korea, etc. One of the unique challenges is I think it stems from the kind of local nuclear and conventional advantages that adversaries may have against a U.S. alliance. Adversaries that might otherwise be um, unwilling to risk direct confrontation with the U.S. and its allies, they might perceive that these local balances of power that are favorable to them um, actually take on a greater incentive to be used when the U.S. is perceived to be unwilling or unable to come to the aid of their allies. So it has a perverse incentive of actually encouraging aggression. It's the old adage that weakness invites aggression. And if that's the case, then adversaries that may be willing to be deterred today might be unwilling to be deterred tomorrow. It actually incentivizes them moving from willing to be deterred to unwilling to be deterred because they sense that they could achieve their objectives at less cost. Second, I think without changes to the U.S. conventional and nuclear force structure, the threats of coordinated and opportunistic aggression are likely going to force U.S. leaders to prioritize between sets of allies in different geographic regions. Um, Again, what happens in one theater is going to severely impact what happens in another theater. So if the US is in a conflict with Russia in Europe and allies in Asia perceive the United States as not doing enough for those allies in Europe, or not doing enough for the allies in Asia who are trying to deter opportunistic aggression at that point, um, that can actually have an effect in both theaters. It's the point that assurance and extended deterrence gets the failures, in perceived failures at least, in those areas, those failures get multiplied. It's not just confined to one theater. And so, yes, even if failure is multiplied, a critic might say success could also be multiplied. If we succeed in one theater, then that should help us in another theater. And I agree with that on the logical aspect of things. But I think when you look at how we're postured, that's less likely than facing a severe uphill battle in one theater while trying to deter a state that is unwilling to be deterred in a second theater. Third, without changes to the U.S. conventional force size and posture, the United States may need to rely more on nuclear weapons to deter or defeat opportunistic or coordinated aggression. Now, relying more on nuclear weapons can take a whole host of different forms, uh, whether it is warfighting, we simply don't have the conventional forces to do what we need to do, and therefore we rely on non strategic nuclear weapons to accomplish set military goals. It could increase reliance on nuclear weapons, could mean additional signaling. It could mean um, pulling dual use like bombers, pulling them into a theater and doing demonstrations of force there. That's going to be really difficult since they'll be in high demand in a current conflict. It could mean lower thresholds, a lower proclaimed threshold for nuclear use. It could mean wholesale force postures. It could mean going on alert. I only go along this list just to demonstrate there's a whole host of ways we could rely more on nuclear weapons, but it's ways that we are not currently used to doing. Uh, Russia seems to threaten nuclear use on every day that ends in Y. We are just not equipped to do that. We don't speak the language of coercion as fluently as they do. So when we do signal an increased reliance on nuclear weapons, that may be to our advantage because it will look different to our adversaries. We will be, acting out of character. But I think this is an issue that deserves more study of how do we speak the language of coercion and deterrence in ways that our adversaries can understand um, that we are in a really tough spot and we really are relying more on nuclear weapons. And that should induce more caution instead of inducing what they think is an opportunity. Because if they believe the United States is not willing to ultimately employ nuclear weapons, that could actually lead to deterrence failure. So we need to study more. Maybe that's what a future paper will be on, but study more. How do we get to this point where we can better anticipate the messages that China, Russia, North Korea, and Iran, what kind of messages they're going to need to hear and in what forms so that they receive the message loud and clear that the United States has increased reliance on nuclear weapons, and that should induce caution in their approach. Fourth and finally, of a unique aspect of opportunistic aggression is political and military leaders in the US and potentially allies. We may need to rely more on riskier strategies within a conflict that potentially hold out greater hope of ending that conflict favorably so we can shift forces to another theater to prevent deterrence failure. So, US leaders in other less stressing circumstances may prefer to observe certain operational restraints, like uh, refraining from homeland to homeland strikes. That may be one threshold we want to observe normally. But there's going to be great pressure in a scenario of opportunistic aggression to remove those restraints. Even if we would like them from a preventing escalation standpoint, we may need to deliberately escalate a conflict ourselves to end it quickly or prevent a loss. In either case, we're going to have to pursue a riskier strategy to prevent deterrence failure elsewhere. And let me say a note on what I did in this report when it comes to case studies, because I was curious, could we actually learn some lessons from history, from Cold War specifically, where nuclear weapons played a major role? And is there anything we can learn from that? And I think the Korean War and the Cuban Missile Crisis both stood out as important in this regard. I won't go through each case study here just because I want to be mindful of the time and move to the Q&A as quick as possible. But let me just say a quick couple words on the Korean War, the Cuban Missile Crisis, and why I see both of these as um, cases of opportunistic aggression that the United States sought to deter. So during the Korean War, um, President Harry Truman had drastically cut back the U.S. military following World War II, and that was a cost savings measure. And early in the 1950s, NATO had just been created, and so much of the U.S. focus was actually on Europe. The Marshall Plan and building up our European allies to confront the Soviet threat in Stalin in Europe. And infamously, the Korean Peninsula was left out of the defended line in State Department speeches, where we said this is not part of our vital national interests. And since Kim Il sung was perfectly willing to invade North Korea even before that, he took that as a sign that the US was unlikely to intervene, or at least intervene in a big way. And Stalin eventually gave him permission um, and Mao to help with the invasion. And so the US military was unprepared for a conflict in Korea, and it had to make quite a few changes. Curtis LeMay was famously at Strategic Air Command. Excuse me, he was he was at Strategic Air Command, and he was furious that uh, the Joint Staff was taking some of his bombers that were meant for the uh, war plan against the Soviet Union and using them for the Korean conflict that caused a whole host of operational difficulties that he had to overcome. Um, One thing I think is really interesting about this case study is that uh, Great Britain was very supportive of U.S. actions in Korea to shore up the South Korean government and uh, and to do as much as possible to prevent communist takeover of the peninsula. But as soon as the U.S. went north of the 38th parallel, the British mood completely changed, and they started putting pressure on the Truman administration to pull back stop pouring so many resources into Korea because they were going to risk deterrence failure in Europe. And a whole host of European countries agreed with that. And what made it difficult for the Truman administration was the Allies kept saying, stop sending so much to Korea, send it to Europe. We need it more than Korea. But the Allies also said, but don't lose in Korea because that makes us look bad in Europe. And it makes the US look like a not very good security guarantor. And so the Allies were essentially sending the US leadership contradictory messages. And they even recognized that they were sending contradictory messages. And the Truman administration had to walk this really horrible tightrope of trying to help in one area in Korea and not do too much that it caused deterrence failure in Europe, but also not do too little so that they looked like they were actually winning. This again plays out in the Cuban Missile Crisis, which I'll get to in a moment. But let me just list three quick kind of principles that I see coming out of the Korean conflict. Victory in a limited conflict, which the Korean War was, may be ideal for deterring opportunistic or coordinated aggression, but the cost of victory may be deterrence failure in that second theater. And we see that with General MacArthur, especially pushing for more and more resources from Washington when he was the commander in Korea. And his argument was, I agree with you, Joint Staff, that the US needs to pour more forces into Europe. That is the higher priority theater, and therefore you need to give me more forces in Korea to end this conflict very, very quickly. Once we do that, once we achieve complete decisive victory, that's the quickest way we can actually shift those forces to Europe. But the Joint Staff disagreed with him and essentially held the forces in Korea steady because they wanted to put as many new forces into Europe as they could. But again, this leads to the conclusion that if you try to achieve decisive victory in one theater, the cost you may be paying for that is risking deterrence failure in a second theater. The second major conclusion from the Korea conflict is that threat perceptions and military requirements are likely to change far more quickly than nuclear forces and conventional forces can adapt, potentially incentivizing us to accept riskier strategies. This goes back to the kind of quote that Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld famously had, which is, you go to war with the army you have, not the army you might want or wish to have at a later time. And this was very true in the Korean War. The US had demobilized after World War II, and the Air Force actually had to decide to triple itself because the Korean War changed threat perceptions about how risk-taking the Soviets were willing to be and how difficult fighting around the world was going to be. And so even by the end of the Korean War, 1953, after a almost doubling of the defense budget, only then was the Air Force actually getting close to achieving what it needed to for that European theater, while at the same time fighting in the Korean theater. And third, let's see, I think third, adversaries are likely to adapt their strategies if they believe that the United States is ill-equipped or unwilling politically to counter opportunistic and coordinated aggression. And we actually see some evidence of that with the Chinese when they were trying to decide whether to intervene in the Korean conflict. And one of the things they decided is that the Soviet nuclear umbrella at the time was sufficient that the US wouldn't use nuclear weapons because they would fear bringing the Soviets into the conflict. And so that belief from the Chinese actually helped lead them to uh, think that intervention was actually going to be uh, profitable at an acceptable cost, that they could support their kind of Korean allies uh, without too much fear of being hit with U.S. nuclear weapons, because the Soviets, the U.S., from their perception, wouldn't want the Soviet Union to then enter the conflict if they used nuclear weapons, especially against China. Again, Soviets and China had just the year before, in 1950, had signed a security treaty, vowing to come to each other's aid. So the U.S. had very strict operational restraints that prevented and sought to avoid enlarging the conflict beyond the peninsula. Like, our bombers couldn't travel into mainland China. The Soviets and the Chinese observed that same kind of unspoken tacit agreement and didn't send their air forces into Korea. All of that was meant to kind of keep the conflict contained in Korea and avoid opportunistic aggression. Um, I don't have a ton of time left, but real quickly, let me touch on the Cuban Missile Crisis. And again, I think this is another really interesting case for opportunistic aggression. And typically, when you think of the Cuban Missile Crisis, as you should, you think of Cuba. Um, but there was a Berlin crisis in 1961. And I think in some ways, the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962 was sort of a continuation of that Berlin crisis in 1961. All throughout 61 and 62, President Kennedy kept hearing reports from his intelligence that the Soviets desperately wanted to take West Berlin. Uh, you'll remember that there was East Germany and West Germany, and then there was a few air corridors and road corridors that led to the city of Berlin. And Berlin itself was divided into East Berlin, which was controlled by the Soviets and their kind of East German puppet government, and then West Berlin was controlled by the Allies, US, British, French. At that time, the only way the US was going to be able to, quote, defend Berlin in the event the Soviets tried to take all of Berlin was by employing a whole host of nuclear weapons. Uh, US forces, conventional forces in Europe, simply wouldn't be able to um, get there in time. The Soviets could quickly overwhelm the city, and so essentially nuclear employment was the only threat that the US had. So when missiles started appearing in Cuba in early October of 1962, quickly the intelligence community and the broader US political establishment, they figured out that there was a link to Berlin. Khrushchev had not stopped talking about Berlin. And in fact, among the Kennedy administration XCOM, if you read the minutes, um, they were fairly convinced early on that Cuba was something of a feint and it was a distraction meant to take the US eye off of Berlin. Uh, Once it became clear that Cuba was becoming a no joke risk to the United States and its homeland, it quickly became consensus in the Kennedy administration that Khrushchev was doing all of this in Cuba to have a better leverage over Berlin, and they would potentially make a trade. Um, so all of this sort of culminated in, um, while everyone's eyes were on Cuba throughout those days in October, there was always in the background discussions about Berlin and how would U.S. actions or inactions in Cuba affect U.S. The perceptions of the U.S. in Europe. And here again, um, allies played a big role in influencing the beliefs of the Kennedy administration. And it was a jumbled mess. The British were initially very supportive of U.S. actions in Cuba, all the way up to being open to the idea of a U.S. invasion of Cuba. But once it became apparent that the British public was not happy about that idea, um, the British changed their mind and said, we have to try something completely different. We have to only commit to the diplomatic route. And at one point, Secretary of Defense McNamara had to tell the British to not offer the Soviets a a side concession away from the United States in order to diffuse the conflict. The British were contemplating secretly talking to the Soviets in order to de-escalate everything and keep Berlin. The French, on the other hand, were with us 100%. They said all the way up to invasion, go ahead, do whatever you want. Uh, West Germans, same thing. They thought actually, uh, Konrad Adenauer thought that if we invaded Cuba, that would actually be the best for Berlin, that we could then trade Cuba for the continued security of Berlin. Whereas the Italians and a host of other European countries thought if the US acted too rashly in Cuba, it would provide the pretext for the Soviets to take Berlin. So again, all throughout the Cuban Missile Crisis, the US was trying to deter opportunistic aggression. And here's three quick lessons that I took from that case study. And you can read more about in the report if you would like. First, flexible force generation capabilities provide valuable deterrence options for US leaders that improve the ability to send tailored signals and reduce the risk of misperceptions. So the Strategic Air Command at the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis, they ordered what, in their words, was a quiet and gradual raising of the alert level of the bombers, essentially, at that point. There was a few missiles that they, ICBMs, that they also were able to certify at that point. So this quiet and gradual raising of the alert level helped send the signal to the Soviet Union that the United States was not preparing for a large-scale conflict per se, but it was increasing the military readiness of its forces. And the historical record is a bit mixed on why the US ordered this alert. Some in the Kennedy administration think it was to essentially uh, raise military readiness in case the invasion did happen. Others think that it was a signal to the Soviet Union that we're serious and we wanted to avoid conflict or the Soviet entry into the Cuba conflict. Um, we just can't tell enough from the historical record. There's both essentially, but the lesson for today is pretty clear. Having forces that can raise their readiness level non-visibly is a great thing in that it allows us to have this flexibility to employ them should they be needed, but it also sends a good deterrent signal that we can make it visible if we want to. That proved useful in the Cuban Missile Crisis, as we didn't see a whole lot of Soviet posture changes because they were pretty deterred, actually. Second, greater reliance on nuclear weapons in U.S. strategy, including the perceived need to employ them early in a conflict, may be the price to pay for insufficient conventional forces. Again, this goes back to the Berlin question. We didn't have sufficient conventional forces to take back Berlin um, using only conventional forces. We militarily, operationally had to employ nuclear weapons. Third, and finally, there's internal and external factors that may pressure U.S. leaders to adopt riskier, more escalatory warfighting strategies to end a conflict on favorable terms relatively early so that adversaries contemplating opportunistic aggression elsewhere are more likely to be deterred. Again, this was very evident in the Cuban Missile Crisis. Uh, the Kennedy administration adopted courses of action um, against the Soviet bases in Cuba and uh, did so from the perspective of wanting to be able to quickly end the conflict in Cuba and rapidly shift forces to Europe. And even with all these forces on alert, even with a conventional military that at that time had a 2.5 force structure sizing principle. They were prepared for two major wars and a third limited conflict elsewhere in the world, like the Middle East. Um, they thought they had that sufficient conventional forces to do that. But what the Cuban Missile Crisis showed was um, they actually had a hard time maintaining the forces they needed to just for the Cuban Missile Crisis alone. We had to ask the British to do and the Canadians to do more in the GIUK gap, for instance, patrolling for Soviet submarines, because all of our naval assets were suddenly concentrated in this blockade around Cuba. So again, there's all these lessons here for U.S. officials contemplating how to structure our forces moving forward. So let me end my lecture here with just a few recommendations on moving forward based on these case studies, based on the unique threats of opportunistic and coordinated aggression. What should the U.S. do about it? I mostly follow the line of the Strategic Posture Commission by recommending additional submarines, additional bombers, deploying Sentinel ICBM with uploaded warheads. Um, the more interesting recommendations fall on the regional nuclear forces. I think SLCM-N is a great thing, but it's interesting in that this fulfills uh, one of the historical case studies that showed up in the Cuban Missile Crisis, where political authorities wanted to increase the military readiness in case something bad did happen, but they didn't want to do it in a way that could spook the adversary into thinking something was underway. So SLCM-N would be extremely valuable in that regard. It can move to a region. We can tell our allies that it's there, uh, and it can be more ready and bring nuclear effects to bear if needed. But it also doesn't have to do so in a provocative way or ways that could be misinterpreted. Um, I also think there's value in exploring a nuclear armed, land based, mobile long range system, something equivalent to a nuclear version of the Army's long range hypersonic weapon or the Dark Eagle. Uh, I think providing that system or a similar system with a nuclear attack capability would be quite useful in some of these regional scenarios that we're facing, because opportunistic aggression is going to stress forces in theater the most. Those are going to be the ones that are already in being and need to be supported via the homeland, but the homeland itself may be coming under attack in in cases of opportunistic or coordinated aggression. So that means regional forces need to be as strong as possible and sustain for as long as possible. And so additional options in that regard would be great. I also think there's a growing need for a short to medium range, land-based mobile nuclear weapon. Call it, a prism or something along those lines in the 500 kilometers or less uh, field of view. Again, this comes down to additional nuclear signaling options and not allowing the adversary to believe that they have an exploitable, coercive advantage in their regional nuclear forces. This doesn't mean the US has to build up as much as every other country does, but it does encourage us to think about how we might affect their decision calculus, especially when they're primed to think they already have the advantage, that they're already facing an overstretched United States. So that's the sort of adversary the US needs to think about deterring. On missile defense, I think improved and expanded US homeland missile defense will be especially critical in deterring opportunistic and coordinated aggression, uh, especially if the adversaries believe that they have a coercive advantage, especially in the early days of building up this US missile defense system, whether it's Golden Dome or some other follow on. Um, the ability to cause the adversary to think that their coercive attacks on the homeland won't work and would invite a hugely costly response is something that the US really needs to consider and would be especially useful in countering those adversaries that believe they already have a coercive advantage. I don't believe the US is moving towards a two-war construct with its conventional forces. I think ideally we would, but for cost constraint reasons, that's going to be extremely difficult, which again only emphasizes the need for strengthened nuclear forces, strengthened missile defense forces, and essentially relying more on allies to supply their conventional forces in theater. I think I will end there just so we can get to the questions, but I really appreciate everyone's willingness to listen and look forward to the conversation.